My parents said I was too unpredictable to be seen at my sister's wedding. You'll ruin our image, they said. So while they posed for magazines in California, I was in Africa, standing under the open sky saying yes to something real. The video hit 20 million views, the donations poured in, and suddenly the same family that shut me out couldn't stop calling. I'm the daughter they tried to hide, and this is how I became the story they couldn't control. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The sun was sinking behind the hills when I pulled up to my parents' house in Santa Barbara. The glass windows caught the light just right the way my mother liked, everything gleaming, controlled, perfectly framed. Inside, I could already smell rosemary chicken and white wine sauce, the scent of her version of family unity. I stepped out of the car, smoothed my hair, and carried a small bouquet of lilies, my peace offering, though I knew better than to expect peace. When the front door opened, Margaret Hartman stood there, posture straight, pearls glinting at her neck. "Well," she said, voice soft but slicing. "I'm surprised you still remember where we live." "Hard to forget," I said, handing her the flowers. She accepted them with a practiced smile, like a hostess greeting a guest, not a mother welcoming her daughter. Inside, the dining room glowed gold under the chandelier. My father, Richard, sat at the end of the long mahogany table, reading something on his iPad. He didn't look up when I walked in. My sister Vanessa sat across from him, scrolling through her phone, perfect hair, perfect nails. The picture of the daughter who never said no. "Olivia," she said, without looking up. "You made it." I smiled faintly. Wouldn't miss it. We took our seats. Silver clinked against porcelain wine poured soundlessly. The air between us felt rehearsed like a dinner scene we'd all performed too many times before. My mother adjusted a napkin beside my plate, even though it didn't need adjusting. So she began, voice calm and deliberate. "We need to discuss something before next weekend." I glanced at her. "Next weekend, Vanessa's wedding," she said, like it was an obvious reminder. "There have been a few changes." My father cleared his throat but kept his eyes on the screen. Vanessa shifted slightly, avoiding my gaze. "What kind of changes?" I asked. Margaret folded her hands neatly on the table. "Your name isn't on the guest list." For a moment I thought she was joking. I laughed softly. "What do you mean it's not on the guest list?" "It's better this way," she said. "You know how people talk. Those charity stunts of yours, bringing activists to fundraisers posting about injustice. It reflects poorly on the family. Vanessa's event is very public, and we can't afford distractions." I blinked at her. "Distractions," Richard spoke finally, voice low. "Your mother means you have a way of making things complicated." I turned to Vanessa. "Is that how you feel too?" She didn't meet my eyes. "It's just, Mom's been under a lot of stress. You know how she gets when things need to be perfect." Margaret smiled without warmth. "It's not personal, Olivia. You tend to take things that way." The clinking of silverware stopped. The only sound left was the ticking clock and the faint hum of the refrigerator. I swallowed, forcing the air back into my lungs. "So that's it," I said quietly. "You're cutting me out because I embarrass you." Her tone stayed even. "You embarrass yourself. We're simply protecting you from further humiliation." I looked at my father. "And you're fine with this?" He sighed, still not looking up. "Let's not make a scene." The old phrase hit like a slap. The same words he used when the news broke years ago about the company, when I'd tried to tell the truth, and he'd told me to stay quiet. I stood up slowly. The chair legs scraped against the marble floor, the sound sharp in the silence. "Don't worry," I said. "I wouldn't dream of it." No one stopped me. I walked down the hall toward the door. On the wall hung our family portrait, taken when I was 20, before everything fell apart. I stopped. My father, my mother, Vanessa, smiling under studio lights. My own face had been cropped out and replaced with a soft beige backdrop. My throat tightened. "Olivia." My mother called behind me, voice careful, still trying to sound polite. "Don't take this the wrong way." I turned my head just enough to see her reflection in the glass. "Is there a right way to take it?" She didn't answer. Outside, the air smelled like salt and citrus. I stepped onto the driveway, the bouquet still clutched in my hand, petals bent from the grip. Through the window, I saw them still sitting at the table, frozen in their perfect frame. The door closed behind me with a soft click that sounded like something ending. I walked toward my car, dropped the wilted lilies into a trash bin by the gate, and looked back once. The house glowed under the setting sun, beautiful, cold, and utterly unfamiliar. In my head, the voice I'd spent years silencing finally spoke. I used to think silence kept the peace. but all it ever did was make me easier to erase. The conference room at Hartman and Company always smelled faintly of cedar polish and expensive coffee. In 2015, I was 26, the youngest communications director the company had ever had, and that morning I was already shaking before I opened my laptop. Through the glass wall, the Pacific shimmered bright and perfect, like it didn't know how much ugliness hid inside these walls. My presentation was ready. Slides, data copies of zoning permits that didn't match. I'd checked them a dozen times. I waited while the executives filed in all polished smiles and murmured greetings. My father came last, jacket, crisp face unreadable. When he sat at the head of the table, everyone else quieted, like students waiting for the teacher to speak. I stood, cleared my throat, and began. The new Oceanside development has discrepancies in the property files. The acreage listed in the city's approval documents doesn't match what we submitted. Several signatures appear to be copied. The words hung heavy in the air. My father didn't look at me at first. He stared down at the tablet in his hands, scrolling slowly, as if the truth might disappear if he didn't acknowledge it. Finally, he said, "You must have misread something." "I didn't," I said. "I verified every file. If we move forward, we're violating zoning laws. We could lose our license." He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "We've already closed on the partnership. Everything's signed. What you're suggesting could cost us millions. Then we fix it," I said, "before someone else finds it." His gaze lifted, then sharp and cold. "Olivia, do you have any idea how this company stays alive? We adapt. We manage optics. We don't panic over paperwork." I took a breath that felt like glass in my chest. "This isn't about optics. It's about ethics." The room went still. I could feel every eye on me waiting to see if I would keep going or fold. My father's voice dropped low. "You're not here to police me. You're here to make this company look good. I'm here to make it honest." The crack of his palm against the table startled even him. "You don't talk to me that way in my office." "It's my office too," I said. "You gave me the title." He stood face flushed with anger and said, "Then consider it revoked." Silence, only the faint hum of the air conditioner and the ocean beyond the glass. I gathered my papers, hands trembling. "Then handle this without me." When I turned, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the window, small, blurred, but standing tall. I walked out without looking back. That night, the office lights burned long past midnight. I stayed at my desk finishing the internal report for the compliance board. The building was quiet except for the low hum of the copy machines. Around 11, my screen froze. I refreshed, tried again, then saw the message, "Access denied." My heart dropped. Within minutes, my email locked me out too. I sat there staring at the blank screen, the cursor blinking like an accusation. By the next morning, a company-wide memo announced my temporary leave. They called it an internal realignment. My phone buzzed with messages from coworkers pretending to check in, but really fishing for gossip. I ignored them all. That evening, I drove to my parents' house. The lights inside were low, the kind of expensive dimness that made everything look tasteful. My mother sat at the kitchen counter, a glass of wine in her hand, scrolling through her phone. She didn't look up. "You shouldn't have done that," she said. I leaned against the doorway, told the truth. "Sometimes the truth costs too much," she said. "Your father is furious. He's furious because he got caught." Her head lifted slowly. Her eyes were cool, calculated. "Because you embarrassed him. And us." I laughed, but it came out wrong. I was trying to protect the company's name. She swirled her wine, watching the liquid move. "Families don't need martyrs, Olivia. They need loyalty. Blind loyalty isn't love." "This family doesn't need someone who always has to be right," she said, turning away. "It needs someone who knows when to be quiet." The words hit harder than the meeting that morning. They didn't even sound like advice, more like a rule I was expected to live under. I left before she could say anything else. Outside, the night air was thick with fog from the ocean. The drive back to my apartment felt endless. When I parked, I just sat there staring at the dashboard trying to remember the moment when I stopped belonging to them. As I looked in the rearview mirror, the house lights behind me blurred into streaks of gold. I once believed justice was forcing them to admit they were wrong. Now I understood. It was having the courage to walk away from a place that no longer deserved my silence. The suitcase lay open on the bed, half filled with clothes notebooks, and the sound of decisions I couldn't undo. My apartment in downtown Santa Barbara was small, clean, and quiet, but that morning even the silence felt loud. I folded a shirt, then reached for the photograph sitting on the nightstand, a picture of me and Vanessa, maybe 9 and 6 years old, holding melting ice cream cones in front of the pier. Our faces were sticky and happy, the kind of happiness that didn't require permission. I slid it carefully between the pages of my journal. The door clicked behind me. Ethan walked in without knocking, camera bag slung over his shoulder, his hair still wet from the morning shower. He looked at the suitcase and then at me. "So it's really happening," he said. "It has to," I replied. He came closer, wrapping his arms around my waist from behind. "You're sure about this? About leaving everything?" I looked down at his hands over mine. Everything left me first. He rested his chin on my shoulder. "They'll come around." "No, they won't," I said, soft but steady. "They think I destroy everything I touch." Maybe they're right. Maybe I just don't belong inside those walls anymore. Ethan didn't answer. He kissed my temple instead, a wordless agreement that silence was safer than arguing with ghosts. By noon, the sun over Los Angeles was a pale blur through smog. We parked at LAX, dragging our luggage through the crowd. The terminal buzzed with the sound of intercoms, crying children rolling suitcases. Ethan checked in our bags while I stared up at the departure board, Los Angeles to Nairobi, 5:25 p.m. My pulse ticked with every second closer to that gate. While we waited, he snapped a photo of me looking out the glass wall at the runway. For the before, he said, I smiled faintly. "You're assuming there'll be an after." "There always is," he said, "even if it's not the one you planned." We found a quiet corner near the gate. A little boy sitting 2 seats down was telling his mother that he wanted to see elephants. His excitement was so pure it made me ache. I wondered when I'd stopped talking about what I wanted without apology. Boarding was called. The overhead lights flickered once, the kind of blink that makes you think of omens. Ethan reached for my hand as we stepped onto the jet bridge. When we settled into our seats, I opened my notebook. The pages smelled faintly of coffee and rain from an earlier life. I wrote a single line. If I was ever called crazy, at least I was crazy for something that mattered. The words sat there on the page, small but certain. I underlined them twice, as if doing so would make them truer. The engines roared to life. Through the window, I watched the city stretch out below, the coastline, the red roofs, the glittering promise of the place I'd tried to love. As the plane tilted upward, Los Angeles dissolved into clouds, the Pacific opening like a mirror. Ethan squeezed my hand. "You okay?" I nodded, just trying to remember what it feels like to start over. He smiled, that easy, patient smile that always made me braver. Then, "This is the right flight." For the first hour, I watched the sky change color. The sun faded into a burning orange strip, then bled into deep crimson. I thought about my mother's voice, precise and sharp, telling me that silence was loyalty. I thought about my father's hands gripping the edge of the table, the veins standing out like ropes. For the first time, none of it made me angry. It just felt distant, like watching a movie I'd already seen too many times. Dinner came and went. Ethan dozed off, his head tilted against the seat. I couldn't sleep. The cabin lights dimmed, and the world outside turned dark. I traced the outline of the photo tucked into my notebook, our childhood smiles pressed together in frozen time. When the first light of dawn reached the horizon, it painted the clouds in gold and coral. I pressed my forehead to the window and whispered mostly to myself. This is what freedom looks like. Leaving isn't always escape. Sometimes it's the only way to remember who you were before the noise taught you to disappear. Somewhere over the Atlantic. As the sky burned red behind us, I finally let myself breathe. The air in Makuani was heavier than I expected, thick with heat dust and the scent of dry grass. From the car window, the land stretched in every direction like an ocean of gold. The sun was relentless, but the colors were alive. Crimson cloths hung on wooden fences, goats bleated in the distance, and children ran barefoot across the dirt road, chasing a ball made from tied rags. Ethan leaned out of the passenger window with his camera snapping photos. "Look at this light," he said. "It's like the air itself is glowing." When the jeep stopped, we were met by a woman in a faded blue dress and a wide straw hat. Her skin was deep bronze, her eyes soft but sharp with intelligence. "You must be Olivia and Ethan," she said. "Welcome to Makuani." Her name was Sister Agnes. She ran the community center and the small school our foundation partnered with. As she shook my hand, she smiled with a warmth that cut through the heat. "You've come a long way to listen," she said. "That's good. Most people come here to talk." We followed her down a narrow path lined with acacia trees to a cluster of low clay buildings. Chickens darted between our feet, and the laughter of children carried from somewhere nearby. Ethan turned, camera still in hand, unable to stop shooting. The children noticed and ran toward him, shouting words I didn't yet understand. One little boy poked the lens with a stick, then jumped back, giggling. Ethan lowered the camera and crouched. "You want to see?" he asked, showing them the screen. They gasped and crowded around their reflections, flashing in their wide eyes. One girl stood a little apart, watching me. She was small, with hair tied into short braids and a purple ribbon around her wrist. When our eyes met, she smiled and walked over, holding something behind her back. "For you," she said, revealing a wild violet wilted on one side. I knelt so we were eye level. "It's beautiful. What made you think to give it to me?" She shrugged, then said in careful English, "You bring light." I laughed softly. "Why do you think that?" "Because you smile like the sun," she said simply, and ran off before I could respond. Her name, I learned later, was Grace. 7 years old, born during a drought, left with Sister Agnes after her mother died. I wrote her name in my notebook that evening, under the heading, "Stories Worth Remembering." The afternoon passed in a haze of movement. Ethan photographed the classrooms and the well. I took notes for a potential report. Sister Agnes told us about their struggles, the rains that didn't come, the crops that failed the children who walked miles each morning just to reach the school. Yet no one we met complained. They greeted us with laughter, with songs. By dusk, the sky turned copper. The whole village gathered in the open clearing near the center. A fire burned in the middle, the smoke rising slow and steady. We sat on wooden benches while plates of rice beans and roasted vegetables were passed around. The food was simple, but it tasted like something honest. Across the fire, a man started drumming. The rhythm was deep and contagious, rolling through my bones. A group of children stood and began to dance. Grace was among them, her purple ribbon flashing in the firelight. Ethan raised his camera again, but then lowered it. "Some moments shouldn't be captured," he whispered. I nodded, resting my chin on my knees. The air smelled like wood smoke and soil. I thought of the dinners back home, the cold silverware, the way conversation always felt like walking on glass. Here, there was noise, real, joyful noise. And no one cared what I was wearing or who I was supposed to be. Later, when the stars appeared, brighter than I'd ever seen, I sat outside the small guest hut and opened my journal. The paper felt rough under my hand. I wrote, "No one here asks where I came from, what I lost, or who I disappointed. They only ask what I can give." Ethan came out and sat beside me, his camera in his lap. "You look different," he said. "Different how lighter," he said, smiling, "like you finally put something down." I looked toward the open fields. The drums had stopped, but the echo lingered. The children's laughter floated on the wind. In a place where no one needed business cards or last names for the first time in years, I felt like enough, just as I was. The afternoon sun filtered through the branches of the acacia tree, painting, shifting patches of gold across the ground. Ethan and I sat in the shade, our backs against the trunk, watching the children run after a ball made of plastic bags and twine. The air was still warm, filled with the scent of dust and the sound of laughter. Ethan lifted his camera, but didn't take a photo. He just watched them, then turned to me. "You know," he said, "if we ever got engaged, I'd want it to happen somewhere like this." I looked at him, startled, then laughed. "Here, in the middle of a field," he grinned. "Why not?" "It's real. Everything here is real. No staged smiles, no press releases, just people and joy." I shook my head, still smiling. "My family would call that insane." "Then let them," he said. "They've called you worse." I picked up a handful of dry grass and let it slip through my fingers. "If I do this, if we do this, I'll be proving them right. The girl with crazy ideas who never knows when to stop." Ethan reached for my hand. "Or maybe you'll prove that those ideas are exactly what the world needs. Maybe you'll change something again." The words landed deep. The last time someone had told me I could change anything, I was still naive enough to believe it. Now, hearing it from him, I wanted to believe again. I looked out at the horizon. The sky was endless, the color of copper and honey. "If we did," I said slowly, "I wouldn't want it to be just about us. It should mean something." He nodded, already understanding. "What if we turned it into a fundraiser? We could use the live stream features you used to manage for campaigns back in A. Show people this place, these kids. You think anyone would watch?" He smiled. "They watched when you spoke truth to your father's empire. They'll watch this too." That night I couldn't sleep. I sat at the small wooden table in our hut with my laptop open, the faint hum of insects outside. I drafted an email to a few old contacts from my corporate days. People who still respected me quietly, even if they couldn't say it out loud. I told them I was working on a project in Kenya, that we were organizing a small engagement ceremony to raise awareness for local education programs. I promised transparency. No gimmicks, no PR spin, just light laughter and children. Ethan walked in half asleep, rubbing his eyes. "It's late," he murmured. "You're still working?" "I'm sending invitations," I said. "To who?" "Anyone who still believes in doing the right thing, even when it looks ridiculous." He smiled, leaned against the doorframe. "That's your favorite kind of people." Over the next few days, the plan took shape. Sister Agnes offered the open field near the well. The villagers volunteered to cook and decorate. Grace insisted on collecting wildflowers for the ceremony. Word spread quickly through the nearby communities. Everyone wanted to help. We didn't have a florist, but women from the village wove garlands of dried leaves and purple petals. The men built wooden frames for shade. Ethan set up his small camera and a mobile hotspot for the live stream. I wrote a short speech, something simple about love community and the power of giving. As the preparations grew, I felt the strange thrill of creating something from nothing like I had when I first started my career. Only this time there was no boardroom, no polished glass table, no father waiting to interrupt, just wind laughter and the sound of hammers building joy. On the morning before the ceremony, I stood in the middle of the empty field, watching the sunrise turn everything gold. My heart pounded, a mix of fear and exhilaration. Ethan came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my shoulders. "Second thoughts," he asked. "Always," I said. "But they're quieter now." He kissed my cheek. "Then let's make some noise worth hearing." Later, I wrote in my journal, I used to fear being called different. Now I only fear not being brave enough to do something I can be proud of. When I closed the book, the sounds of preparation floated through the air. Voices singing, children laughing, life unfolding in ways no press release could ever capture. The morning sun rose sharp and clear, cutting through the haze that had hung over Makuani all week. By the time I stepped outside the hut, the air was already alive with sound. Laughter, the beat of drums, the metallic rhythm of hammers fixing wooden poles into the earth. Ethan was at the center of its shirt, rolled up sleeves streaked with dust as he tied vines between bamboo stakes. "We might have invented a new kind of wedding decor," he said, grinning. I laughed, shading my eyes. Around us, the villagers moved with the easy coordination of people used to building things together. Women carried bundles of hay and armfuls of wildflowers. Children ran in circles, giggling as they tossed petals into the air. Someone handed me a garland of green leaves and yellow flowers, its scent faint but sweet. Sister Agnes appeared beside me, holding a bracelet made of small red and white beads. "For good fortune," she said, slipping it over my wrist, made by Grace herself. I looked down at the tiny pattern, uneven but perfect in its imperfection. "Tell her I'll never take it off," I said. She smiled. She already knows. The village square transformed as the sun climbed higher. The ground was swept clean, the well decorated with ribbons. A few men carried a wooden table to the center, covering it with a woven cloth. On it, Ethan placed a single handmade ring, silver wire twisted around a bead of amber we'd found at the market the day before. When I stepped back to take it all in, it hit me that this noise, this color, was the most beautiful chaos I'd ever stood in. There were no guests flown in from the city, no photographers, no floral designer with a mood board. Just the hum of life stitched together by hands that didn't care about last names. Ethan walked over, brushing the dust from his jeans. "You ready?" "As ready as I'll ever be," I said, feeling my pulse quicken. He looked at me the way people do when they're trying to remember something forever. "You look like the sun decided to stay." I rolled my eyes but smiled anyway. "You always say that because it's always true." Sister Agnes raised her hands. The drumming quieted for a moment, replaced by the low hum of anticipation. Then slowly the rhythm returned, steady, heartbeat, deep. Ethan took my hands, the warmth of his skin grounding me as the crowd gathered close. "Olivia Hartman," he said softly. "I don't need a church or a contract to promise you this. I just need today." My throat tightened. "Then I'll promise you the same. No grand vows, just truth." We laughed as a gust of wind blew dust around us, the children squealing and chasing the swirl of petals it carried. From the corner of the crowd, a young man lifted his phone recording. His screen glowed in the sun. "I'm live," he shouted. Yeah, love beyond borders. The words rippled through the crowd like a spark. People laughed, clapped, waved at the camera. Ethan grinned. Guess we're famous now. I squeezed his hand. Let's at least finish getting engaged before we go viral. The drums rose louder, joined by hand claps and the bright chorus of voices singing in Swahili. Grace danced at the front, twirling in a white dress someone had sewn overnight. The energy pulsed through the field. Joy without script, ceremony without rules. When Ethan slipped the ring onto my finger, the crowd erupted in cheers. My eyes stung. Maybe it was the light, or maybe it was everything. The distance from the life I'd left, the nearness of something finally honest. Someone handed us cups of homemade tea, spiced and hot. The children surrounded us, pulling at my hands, urging me to dance. For once, I didn't resist. Ethan joined in, laughing, both of us clumsy and free. Across the world, I had once been told that appearances mattered more than sincerity. But here with my bare feet in the dust, and music vibrating through my bones, I realized how small that world really was. When the drums slowed, we stood in the center, breathless and smiling. The phone camera still rolled. On the screen, the sun flared so bright it blurred our faces. Hours later, as the sky deepened into violet, I sat by the well watching the children chase the last rays of light. Ethan sat beside me, shoulder to shoulder. They'll probably think this was some wild idea, I said. He tilted his head, smiling. I laughed quietly. And yet it worked. In the distance, I could still hear the hum of voices, joy lingering like smoke after a fire. I used to think love needed a stage, something grand enough to prove its worth. But between the dust, the sunlight, and the laughter of strangers, I finally understood happiness doesn't need an audience. It only needs to be true. 2 days after the ceremony, the dust had settled back over the fields, and the noise of the drums was just a memory. Ethan and I were back at the Children's Center, helping Sister Agnes organize supplies in a small storage room that smelled faintly of chalk and rain. Grace sat at a wooden table, carefully gluing colored paper together, humming a song I didn't recognize. Life felt quiet again, honest again, like the world had exhaled. Outside, the air was heavy with the promise of rain. Ethan looked up from the boxes and said, "Feels strange, doesn't it? How fast something beautiful fades back into normal." I smiled. That's how it should be. Things don't have to last forever to matter. Neither of us knew then that somewhere across the ocean our normal was beginning to unravel. In New York, thousands of miles away, Julia Stein sat at her desk at CNN Digital, scrolling through trending videos. A clip titled "Love Beyond Borders" filled her screen. Our faces blurred by sunlight, the crowd dancing, the laughter of children echoing in the background. She replayed it 3 times, then leaned back in her chair. "This isn't just a love story," she murmured. "This is a global story." She picked up her phone and called her editor. "You need to see this." By the time the sun set over Makuani, the video had already reached 10 million views. The hashtag #LoveBeyondBorders was everywhere. Instagram reels, Facebook shares, TikTok, edits set to soft acoustic covers. People across the world posted comments. This restored my faith in humanity. Real love exists. Where can I donate? When Ethan and I returned to our small hut that night, his phone wouldn't stop vibrating. Notifications flooded the screen. "Babe," he said slowly, scrolling through his feed, "we're everywhere." I frowned. "What do you mean, everywhere?" He turned the screen toward me. It was our video, the one the young man had streamed from his phone. Millions of views, thousands of shares. My face, frozen mid-laugh, was now someone's favorite symbol of hope. My stomach tightened. "Oh God," Ethan grinned. "Oh God, indeed. Look at this. People are donating to global hope. It's unbelievable." I sank down on the bed. "It's too much." "We didn't plan this. That's what makes it work," he said, still scrolling. "It's real. That's why it's spreading." The next morning, Sister Agnes found us outside, her phone in hand. "You too might want to see this," she said. On her screen was an online article titled, "From a Kenyan Field to the Heart of the World." The reporter had called it a moment of pure, unfiltered humanity. I read the line twice. My chest ached in a way I couldn't name, part awe, part fear. I'd spent years trying to make people listen for the wrong reasons. Now they were listening for the right ones, and I didn't know what to do with that kind of attention. By noon, the Global Hope Foundation's donation page was crashing under traffic. The total jumped from $200 to $1.5 million, then past $3 million within 2 days. Ethan couldn't stop refreshing the page. 3.1 million, he said, voice shaking. Olivia, do you understand what this means? I looked at the children playing in the yard, unaware of the storm brewing online. It means we can build something that lasts, but not everyone saw it that way. Back in Washington, Claire Simmons, director of Humanity First, a competing NGO, was sitting in her own office watching the same video. She typed a tweet without hesitation. Is this heartfelt charity or another PR stunt by a former corporate insider trying to clean her image? Transparency matters. The post exploded. Within an hour, hundreds of comments debated whether our story was genuine or manipulative. Some praised us. Others demanded accountability. An email from CNN arrived in my inbox that night. Request for comment. Allegations of misrepresentation regarding the Love Beyond Borders campaign. Attached was a message from Claire herself to their newsroom, questioning the legitimacy of the fundraiser. Ethan read over my shoulder. We should respond. At least clarify who we are, how the money's being handled. I closed the laptop gently. No. He blinked. No, Liv. If we stay quiet, they'll control the story. I don't need to win the story, I said. Let them talk. The truth doesn't need me to defend it. He sighed, sitting beside me. You really believe that I have to? I said, otherwise I'm back where I started, trying to prove myself to people who never wanted to understand. The night deepened. Outside, the crickets sang in the tall grass. The air smelled of smoke from nearby cooking fires. My phone buzzed again, this time with messages from old colleagues. Some congratulated me, some asked how they could get involved, and a few were thinly veiled accusations about image building and optics. I didn't reply to any of them. Later, as Ethan slept beside me, I opened my notebook and wrote, They're watching now, but I won't let their noise drown out what this really is. I paused, then added, Kindness doesn't need evidence to exist. It only needs to keep going. When I closed the notebook, the wind outside carried a faint echo of drums from a neighboring village, like a heartbeat reminding me that joy once found doesn't vanish just because the world doubts it. The living room in Santa Barbara glowed the way it always did at night. Low light, perfect angles, nothing out of place. The television played softly at first background noise to another quiet dinner. Then Margaret heard the words Kenya and American woman and reached for the remote. On the screen, CNN ran footage from the engagement. My face filled the frame for half a second, sunlight blinding the edges. The anchor's voice was smooth and professional. A California woman's engagement ceremony in rural Kenya has raised over $3 million for children's education through the Global Hope Foundation. The sound of laughter and drums echoed faintly through the speakers, filling the sterile room with a kind of life that didn't belong there. Margaret's expression hardened. She's done it again, she said. She's turned us into a circus act. Richard didn't respond. He sat on the edge of the sofa, a glass of scotch trembling slightly in his hand. The amber liquid caught the flicker of the TV. Turn it down, he muttered. Vanessa, sitting beside him, couldn't look away. On screen, I was smiling, surrounded by villagers dancing in a circle. The caption read, Love Beyond Borders, one woman's act of kindness goes viral. Margaret grabbed the remote and muted the volume, but the images kept playing. The colors too bright, the joy too loud for their pristine house. Does she even realize what she's done, she said. Every headline has our name attached to it. Richard's jaw tightened. It's her name, not ours. People will make the connection. Margaret snapped. They always do. If reporters start digging, the 2015 case could resurface. Do you want that? He didn't answer, but his silence said enough. His fingers clenched tighter around the glass, until it nearly slipped. Vanessa turned from the screen. Mom, it's not a scandal. She raised money for children. Please, Margaret said. You're too naive. It's a stunt, like always. Olivia thrives on drama. Vanessa shook her head slowly. You don't know her anymore. Margaret ignored her and picked up the phone from the coffee table. I'm calling Samuel. Across town, attorney Samuel Reed answered on the second ring. Mrs. Hartman, he said, voice dry and composed. I need you to make sure our name is protected. I don't want the family associated with this spectacle. If necessary, send a cease and desist to the foundation. Use legal language about unauthorized use of likeness reputation, whatever fits. Samuel hesitated. I'll draft something tonight. Good, she said, ending the call before he could add anything else. For a long moment, no one spoke. The muted television continued looping the same footage, children dancing, hands clapping, sunlight breaking through dust. The image repeated like a heartbeat, and something inside Vanessa cracked. She stood abruptly. "I'm going to my room." Margaret didn't stop her. She was too busy scrolling through her phone, searching for articles, counting every mention of their last name. Vanessa closed the door behind her and sat on the edge of her bed. The only light came from her laptop. She opened the same video again, watching it from the beginning this time. It started with the sound of wind, then the drums, then me laughing, barefoot, my white dress moving in the breeze, children spinning around me. Ethan took my hand, whispering something the microphone didn't catch, and the crowd erupted in cheers. Vanessa pressed a hand to her mouth. For a moment, she saw not the sister her parents condemned, but the one who used to chase her down the hallway with frosting on her fingers. The one who'd sneak into her room after arguments just to make her laugh. The comment section scrolled by in a blur. "This woman's spirit is incredible. Proof that love still matters. Hartman. Like the real estate family? If so, that's wild." She closed the laptop halfway, staring at the reflection of her own face in the screen. Downstairs, the television was still on mute. The headlines stayed frozen at the bottom. From a California family's outcast to a global inspiration. My mother poured another drink. My father stared at the reflection of the flames in the glass, and somewhere in the silence between them I knew, though I couldn't hear it, that they weren't proud of me. They were afraid of what my truth might reveal about theirs. On the other side of the world, I was dancing under the open sky. In their house behind closed curtains, they were still trying to keep the lights from exposing the cracks. They didn't celebrate me. They calculated the risk. They didn't see a daughter. They saw a mirror, and the reflection terrified them. The envelope arrived at sunrise, thin and official, stamped with the seal of a law firm I knew too well. Samuel Reed, attorney at law. The name alone made my stomach twist. The letterhead was heavy, expensive paper. My family's preferred way of reminding people of their power. I tore it open slowly. The language was cold and clinical. Cease and desist from any and all use of the Hartman name in association with Global Hope Foundation or its affiliates. Immediate suspension of fundraising activities is required to avoid legal action. It was absurd, a threat wrapped in politeness. They wanted to erase me again this time, not from a photograph, but from the narrative entirely. Ethan walked in carrying 2 mugs of tea. "What's that?" I handed it to him. His eyes moved across the page, his jaw tightening. "You've got to be kidding me." He looked up, voice rising. "They can't do this, Liv. You've done nothing wrong. You've helped thousands of kids." I took the letter back and set it on the table. "They're not trying to stop the work. They're trying to control the story." "Then we fight it," he said. "We get a lawyer. We go public." I shook my head. "No. They want noise. They want to drag this into the mud and make it about them. Silence is the only language they don't understand." He stared at me for a long time, frustration softening into worry. "You shouldn't have to keep being the bigger person." "Maybe not," I said. "But it's the only way I stay free." The day was hot and still. Outside, the children were painting wooden boards for the new classroom. Their laughter drifted in through the open window. I sat beside Ethan, tracing the edges of the bracelet Grace had made for me. For the first time since the video went viral, I felt the old ache of being small again, like the world was watching, but the people who mattered most only saw something to blame. That afternoon, Julia Stein arrived at the compound, her CNN badge swinging from her neck. She was sunburned and smiling, but her eyes were sharp, curious. "I'm not here for the gossip," she said as we shook hands. "I want to understand why you won't defend yourself." We sat outside under the same acacia tree, where Ethan and I had first talked about the ceremony. She set her recorder on the table. "You've been accused of orchestrating a PR stunt. There's speculation about where the money's going. Don't you think people deserve an explanation?" I looked out toward the field. If I start explaining, the story stops being about the kids. It becomes about me, and that was never the point. She frowned slightly. "But your silence gives them room to define you." "I've lived my whole life trying to correct how people define me," I said. "It never changed what they believed. I'm not going to waste this moment doing the same thing." Julia studied me for a moment, then nodded slowly. That's a very un-American answer, she said with a small smile. We like our heroes loud. Then they'll have to find a louder one, I said. By the time she left, the sky was bleeding orange. I watched her Jeep kick up a cloud of dust down the road until it disappeared. Ethan joined me outside, leaning against the fence. You think she'll write something fair, he asked. I think she'll write something true, I said. That's all I can hope for. Back in the States, the storm was building. Michael Bennett, an investigative journalist for the Chronicle, had started a series titled The Real Hartman Legacy. The first article detailed old zoning violations, shell companies' falsified signatures, the same crimes I'd tried to expose years ago. The second article connected it to my father by name. The headlines spread fast. Hartman and Company stock plummeted. News outlets circled the family estate. My mother, who had spent decades perfecting the image of moral authority, was suddenly silent. My father canceled all meetings. I heard about it from an email forwarded by a friend. You must be feeling vindicated. The world finally knows. But I didn't feel vindicated. I felt hollow. I didn't want revenge. I wanted peace. That night, as the generator hummed in the distance, my phone lit up with a number I hadn't seen in years. My mother's. I stared at it until it stopped ringing. Then it buzzed again. And again. I let it go each time. Ethan came in from outside. You're not going to answer. I shook my head. She's not calling to apologize. She's calling to survive. He sat down beside me. You don't owe them silence forever. I know, I said quietly. But tonight, it's all I have left to give. The phone finally stopped ringing. The night settled back into stillness. The stars above Kenya seemed impossibly close, sharp against the dark. I lay back and closed my eyes, thinking of the house in Santa Barbara, of the portrait that used to hang there, my face cut away. I once dreamed they would say my name with love. Now they only remember it when they need someone to blame. By the time the news reached me, the damage in California was already done. Hartman and Company's downtown headquarters had been sealed off glass doors, plastered with official notices. Reporters crowded the sidewalk cameras, flashing against the mirrored windows that once reflected wealth and confidence. The same newspapers that used to praise my father's visionary leadership now called him a fraud. He'd stepped down within days. The company suspended operations pending investigation. The empire that had defined our family for 3 generations had collapsed in less than a week. I saw the headlines on a tablet at the Children's Center. Hartman and Company under federal probe. Former CEO Richard Hartman resigns. Amid scandal, below the title was a photo. My father walking quickly through a parking garage, face turned away from the cameras. Another picture showed my mother inside her car, her hands over her face as photographers swarmed. The window was half open. Her profile blurred by tears or glare. Someone had captioned it, "The price of silence." I stared at it longer than I should have. I thought I'd feel vindicated, maybe even satisfied. Instead, it felt like staring at an echo, something that had already died long ago but refused to stop making noise. That afternoon, I stood in the courtyard with a group of children, teaching them how to mix paints. Grace sat beside me, focused, her small tongue peeking from the corner of her mouth as she drew. When she finished, she handed me her paper. It was a picture of a woman standing in the middle of a field surrounded by light. "Who's this?" I asked, pretending not to know. She smiled. "You," she said, "because you make the sun come back." My throat tightened. "I think the sun came back on its own," I said softly. She shook her head, certain. "No, it follows you." Ethan was watching from across the yard, camera in hand. He caught my eye and smiled. For the first time in days, I let myself breathe fully. The next morning, the sound of an engine broke the calm. A white SUV pulled up to the edge of the field. At first, I thought it was a new volunteer, or maybe a donor. But when the door opened and Vanessa stepped out, my hands froze mid-air. She wore a plain white shirt and jeans, no makeup, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. She looked smaller than I remembered. Her eyes darted across the courtyard until they found me. Neither of us spoke. The wind picked up swirling dust between us. The children fell silent, sensing something I couldn't explain. Finally, she took a hesitant step forward. "Hi," she said. It was such a simple word, but it cracked something in me. "Hi," I said back. She stopped a few feet away. "You look different," she whispered. "So do you." We stood there staring, 2 halves of a broken reflection finally meeting again. Then her voice broke. "I'm sorry." I blinked, unsure if I'd heard right. "I'm sorry," she repeated, tears already spilling down her face. "I know what happened now. I know what Dad did. I read everything. I wanted so badly to believe you were wrong, because it made things easier. The wind blew harder, carrying her words across the field. I didn't want to hate them, she said. So I chose to hate you instead. For a long time I couldn't move. The years between us, every missed call, every silent holiday, hung heavy in the air. Finally, I stepped forward. You don't have to hate anyone, I said quietly. You just have to start over. Vanessa nodded, shoulders shaking. When I pulled her into my arms, she clung to me like someone afraid to let go again. Around us, the children gathered slowly, curious but gentle. Grace slipped her small hand into mine. Someone started beating a drum in the distance, soft, hesitant at first, then steadier. Ethan raised his camera but didn't take the shot. He just watched. We stood in the middle of the field, wind whipping our clothes dust rising like smoke around us. Vanessa's head rested against my shoulder, her tears soaking through my shirt. The drumbeat grew louder, joined by laughter, by voices singing without words. It felt like the sound was closing something, the echo of anger, of distance, of everything left unsaid. When Vanessa finally pulled away, she wiped her face and smiled through the mess of it. I don't deserve this, she whispered. Neither did I said, but we both get it anyway. The children cheered for reasons they didn't understand, and the noise turned into joy. Grace spun in a circle, her ribbon flying. As the sky shifted toward evening, I looked at Vanessa and thought about how forgiveness isn't a transaction. It's a quiet surrender. It doesn't rewrite the past, but it makes the present lighter to carry. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like anyone's outcast. I just felt free. A full year had passed since the field in Kenya. The morning I arrived in New York, the city smelled like rain and car exhaust, the way it always did when something important was about to happen. The United Nations building towered above the river glass, shining against the gray sky. I hadn't worn a dress like this in years. Plain white, modest, nothing fancy. But as I stood backstage waiting for my name, I realized I didn't need the armor of elegance anymore. A voice over the speaker called, Olivia, Hartman, Global Hope Foundation. I stepped onto the stage, the light so bright it blurred the faces in front of me. The hall was filled with delegates, journalists, and familiar figures from the humanitarian world. Near the front sat Daniel Brooks, the investor who had once believed in me when no one else did. He gave me a small nod, that quiet encouragement only someone who'd seen your worst could give. The podium was cool beneath my hands. My heartbeat slowed. I took a breath. I'm not a hero. I began. My voice surprised me. Steady, calm, older. I was just a woman once called crazy who decided to believe in something good anyway. The room stilled. I saw flashes of cameras from the press section, but they didn't matter. I was taught that silence was loyalty. I continued, that it was better to keep the peace than to speak the truth, but I learned that silence can also be courage, that it can be the loudest voice in the room when it comes from conviction, not fear. I paused. The weight of the moment settled over me. They told me to stay quiet, and I did, but somehow the world heard me anyway. The applause started soft like rain, then grew into a wave that filled the hall. I smiled not at the sound, but at what it meant, that the story wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to every person who had ever been told to sit down and stay silent. When the session ended, Daniel met me by the exit. You were perfect, he said. I was honest, I replied. That's all I ever wanted to be. Outside, the city buzzed with evening traffic. A crowd of reporters gathered near the steps, but I waved them off gently. The attention didn't scare me this time. It just didn't belong to me. Thousands of miles away in Santa Barbara, my mother sat alone in the living room. The TV cast a pale light across the room as she watched the broadcast replay. My image filled the screen for a brief second. Standing straight, smiling calm, Margaret held a letter in her lap, half written, the paper creased where her hand had trembled. She'd started it weeks ago, but tonight she added the final lines. The pen moved slowly. You were right. I feared the truth more than the lies that protected me. I understand now that courage isn't loud. It's the quiet that stays when everything else has fallen apart. She set the pen down, folded the letter, and for the first time in years, let herself cry without shame. I didn't know any of that then. All I knew was the night air against my skin as I stood by the East River shoes in hand, watching the city lights flicker across the water. The sound of applause still echoed faintly in my ears, fading into the hum of the city. Some apologies come too late to change the story, but sometimes they're just in time to heal the parts of it that never should have broken. The morning light in Makuani was soft and gold sliding through the cracks of the wooden shutters. I woke to the sound of birds and the low hum of the wind moving through the tall grass outside. The air smelled faintly of earth and smoke from the early cooking fires. Ethan was already up grinding coffee by hand, his sleeves rolled up, his hair still damp from the wash basin. My phone buzzed again on the table beside me. It had been vibrating since dawn, refusing to rest. When I finally reached for it, the screen glowed bright in the dim room. 77 missed calls. The list of names felt like a ghost story. Mom Vanessa, unknown numbers, press agencies, investors, journalists, people I hadn't spoken to in years. For a moment, I just stared, feeling the strange mix of distance and déjà vu, like looking at my old life through glass. Ethan walked over with 2 mugs, the aroma of coffee warming the air between us. He set one down beside me. "It hasn't stopped buzzing since sunrise," he said. "Who's winning the calling contest?" "Hard to tell," I said, flipping the phone face down. "I'm not answering any of them." He sat beside me. "You sure? Some of those calls might be people trying to help." I smiled faintly. They had their chance to help when it mattered. I looked up, meeting his eyes. "Today we have class. The kids are waiting." He studied me for a second, then nodded, understanding. "You're impossible. You know that?" Maybe I said standing, but at least I'm consistent. Outside, the sunlight stretched wide across the field, turning the dust into a golden haze. The children were already gathered under the shade tree, behind the center, tiny hands clutching paintbrushes, giggling as Grace tried to organize them like a teacher. When she spotted me, she waved both arms. "Miss Liv." "We started without you." I laughed. "Then I'd better catch up." Inside the open classroom, the walls were covered with the paintings we'd done over the last year. Landscapes, animals' portraits. My favorite was one that Grace had painted, of the engagement day, the 2 of us, in the middle of the crowd surrounded by light. The colors were wild, almost too bright, but somehow perfect. I rolled up my sleeves and dipped my hands into a bucket of blue paint. "All right," I said. "Let's make something new." The children cheered. Ethan leaned against the doorframe, camera ready, catching little pieces of chaos. The swirl of colors, the kids' laughter, the way the sun caught the dust in the air. "Liv," he said quietly, "hold still." I turned toward him, still smiling. He raised the camera. Click. I didn't know if he meant to capture the moment for himself, or for the world again, but it didn't matter. This time the story wasn't about redemption or proof. It was just life. By noon, the paintings were hung to dry in the breeze. Grace ran around, showing everyone her masterpiece, a giant sun that took up the whole page streaked with white and yellow, a stick figure standing beneath it. "That's you again," she said proudly. I crouched to her level. "The sun follows me, huh?" She nodded. "Always." The laughter, the music, the smell of paint, they wrapped around me like something sacred. I caught Ethan's eye from across the courtyard, and he mouthed, "You happy?" I nodded, more than happy. Whole. Later, when the kids ran off to lunch, I stepped inside to grab my notebook. The phone on the table still glowed faintly, the missed calls stacked like unanswered history. I picked it up just long enough to look at the number on top, Mom's, then I pressed the side button and watched the screen go black. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was peaceful. Outside, Ethan called for me. "We're short on brushes. Coming," I yelled back, slipping the phone into a drawer. When I stepped outside, Grace tugged my hand, pulling me toward a blank canvas. "You paint too," she said. "All right," I said, laughing. "But only if I get to use the gold." We painted until the sun began to fall. Our fingers sticky with color, the laughter echoing across the fields. Ethan took another photo. Me, surrounded by the children, the sky turning orange behind us, paint on my face. Joy unfiltered. Later, as the evening breeze settled and the sound of drums rose faintly from the nearby village, I looked at the horizon one more time. The phone remained silent inside, but I could still feel its weight. A world that once silenced me now, waiting for my response. They used to stay quiet when I needed to be heard. Now when they want to speak, I choose silence, because not every story needs a reply, and not every wound needs an audience. I don't need their invitations anymore. the world has already opened its door. If you've ever been underestimated or dismissed, remember this. Justice isn't about revenge. It's about living so well that the people who once doubted you have to wonder why they ever let you go.